Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel might well be the book most despised by professional historians today. At first this perplexed me, and then it vexed me, but now I think the whole issue is actually a pretty good teaching tool. So in this video I'm going to go over what the book is about, why so many historians hate it so passionately, and why I think all the main criticisms are completely off base, and what I think we can learn from the attitude of historians to this book. To understand what Guns, Germs, and Steel is about, you first need to understand why Jared Diamond himself said he wrote it. It is pretty remarkable, looking at history, that Europeans colonized nearly all of the Americas, Oceania, and sub-Saharan Africa, while none of those regions ever colonized any substantial part of Eurasia. At one point, the explanation was simple racism, that Europeans were genetically superior, but this hypothesis fell out of fashion after the Second World War for what should be fairly obvious reasons. But as Diamond saw it, since that time there have been no serious attempts to explain the success of Europe without resorting to racism. Diamond, who as an ornithologist and an anthropologist worked a lot among the peoples of Papua New Guinea, felt that it was self-evident that Papuans were every bit as intelligent, capable, and sophisticated as Europeans, but he was also concerned by what seemed to be a rising resurgence of racist explanations. Indeed, his book came out not long after the infamous bell curve. Diamond, therefore, went looking for alternative explanations of European geopolitical success and found it in the geography of Eurasia itself. Two features of Eurasia in particular were notable for Diamond. First, Eurasia maintained a substantial population of large and potentially domesticable animals. Humans evolved in Africa. The large mammals that could potentially be used as draft animals co-evolved with us, and none of the native large mammals in Africa are suitable for domestication. In the Americas and Oceania, on the other hand, humans wiped out the vast majority of the largest animals. But in Eurasia, which had seen waves of previous hominids, the ancestors of horses and cattle survived, at least long enough for modern humans to domesticate them. Secondly, Eurasia is by far the landmass with the longest east-west axis, which made it possible for domesticated animals and plants to spread easily without having to adapt to new climates. These two features together encouraged animal husbandry, which created diseases that Eurasians became at least partially immune to, but which the natives of the Americas, Oceania, and southernmost Africa had no immunity to. Harnessing the power of draft animals also enabled a greater degree of agricultural technology than elsewhere, giving Eurasia a head start, with these technologies spreading laterally from Ireland to Japan. Supporting this hypothesis, Diamond also pointed out two similar cases where displacement happened on a smaller scale under seemingly similar conditions: the spread of the Bantu across Central and Southern Africa, and the spread of the Austronesians across Southeast Asia. However, even if we accept Diamond's main hypotheses, that only explains why Eurasians conquered the rest of the world, and not why it was Europeans specifically. Diamond said that this was outside the scope of his book, but did speculate that the geography of Europe, which encouraged fragmentation and competition between states, may have played a role. In this summary, I have boiled Diamond's thesis down to what I think are the two most essential points. He also talks about some other factors in this book in terms of agriculture that I think are less critical to the hypothesis. But I think these are the two big points you need to understand when it comes to historians' criticism of Diamond, because these are, I think, the two central features of his hypothesis. So with all that out of the way, why do academic historians hate this book so much? Broadly, I've seen a few criticisms pop up over and over again. The first, and probably largest category of criticisms, is that Jared Diamond allegedly got a lot of small historical details wrong, rendering his scholarship suspect. Secondly, I've heard people complain that Jared Diamond is promoting a grand narrative of history, and that grand narratives of history are always wrong. Thirdly, I've heard that Jared Diamond is a geographical determinist, and deterministic theories of history are always wrong. Fourth, I've heard complaints that Jared Diamond is promoting racist theories of history and/or justifying the horrors of European colonialism. And finally, I've heard that Guns, Germs, and Steel is a pop history book, and pop books are inherently lower quality scholarship and intellectually unserious. These at least seem to be the five main categories of criticism I've seen leveled at Guns, Germs, and Steel, or at least the criticisms which I think could be plausibly credible to someone who is not already a staunch critic of Jared Diamond. I've seen a few others that are on the level of, Jared Diamond is not a historian and needs to stay in his lane. I think that such criticisms are so obviously silly that they aren't even worth trying to address. The five categories of criticism I mentioned above at least sound plausible on the surface to a neutral and uninformed listener, and therefore these are the ones which I am going to address. So why do I think historians are wrong about guns, germs, and steel? So if you paid attention to my short summary of the book, it should be pretty obvious why historians are wrong about their third and fourth criticisms. Jared Diamond is neither a determinist nor a racist nor an apologist for colonialism. His account is probabilistic rather than deterministic. He wrote the book explicitly to counter the rising popularity of race-based accounts of the success of the West, and describing how Europe was able to conquer most of the world is not the same thing as saying that Europe was morally justified in doing so. I think it's also pretty easy to dismiss the first criticism. I've read quite a few criticisms of the details that Diamond apparently got wrong, and none of them seem to really affect his central thesis, and particularly not those 2 points that I think are most central to it: the length of the continents east to west, and the availability of domesticable large mammals that could be used as draft animals. Fascinatingly, there was a peer-reviewed paper recently that tried to prove Diamond wrong, and claimed that it had partially proven him wrong, because it disproved a strawman version of the hypothesis that made claims well beyond what Diamond ever did, while seeming to confirm what he actually did say. Now, if Guns, Germs, and Steel were supposed to be a work of academic history, there is no doubt that getting a lot of small details wrong would render it a catastrophic failure, at least for the purposes of being a good academic history. The point of academic history is to focus on a narrow area and period, collect as many verifiable bits of information as possible, and try to paint a picture of that time and place. But of course, Guns, Germs, and Steel is very much not an academic history, and Diamond, an ornithologist turned anthropologist, makes no claim that it is. As for the validity of pop books, I'm going to invoke Sturgeon's law here. At least 90% of pop books are awful, because at least 90% of everything is awful. When it comes to bad pop science and pop history books, if they are bad, it is because they are wrong about their central arguments, but the filter of publication means that they tend to be at least interesting in their claims and competently written. Most academic research is also bad in the sense of being wrong, or at least irreplicable, but because the peer review process encourages academics to write for a very narrow audience who already agrees with them, it tends to be not just usually wrong, it's also usually uninteresting and badly written as well. Indeed, publishers and reviewers seem to have a lower standard for books written by academics than they do for books written by Norman Nobody, the plumber from Peoria. Academics, who think that important ideas require decades of scholarship to develop, are usually telling on themselves as people who have spent decades of scholarship without ever hitting on a genuinely important idea. Part of the problem here is that our conception of the modern sciences, including academic historians' conception of history, is that a scientist should dispassionately gather facts and see where they lead him. But as Thomas Kuhn has observed in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and as Arthur Koestler has pointed out in several of his works, scientific progress has never actually worked that way. The greatest scientists freely admit that they are driven by intuitions and hunches that they then set out to prove. Moreover, which facts you consider worth investigating depends on the paradigm you are operating under. New frameworks for looking at known facts are therefore often much more valuable than new facts, and tend to generate new facts automatically as they develop. Witness the researchers who set out to debunk a straw man of Diamond and ended up corroborating some of his actual predictions. And this brings us to the second criticism I mentioned, the blanket condemnation of grand narrative theories of history. As the field of history developed in early modernity, it tended to be dominated by schools promoting grand narrative theories. My impression is that it was initially dominated by the great man theory of history and by so-called Whig history, which presents history as a tale of linear progress towards modern, liberal, Western democratic civilization, and that these schools were later challenged by theories based on climate and race towards the end of the 19th century. I would like to note here, however, that I am not a historiographer, and I will admit that at best I'm oversimplifying things here dramatically. However, what I am certain about is that modern academic history, as I have said, tends to reject searches for explanations that can explain patterns in history, and this is what they are usually referring to when they complain about grand narratives of history. Now, some grand narrative explanations of history are largely to completely wrong. It seems clear to me that Whig history is an illusion, and to the extent that great men matter, they are the exception rather than the rule. I, like Diamond, do not think that genetic racial differences have played a role in history, and early climatic theories, as far as I know, have also been largely discredited. It also seems pretty obvious to me that if you expect any grand theory of history to explain everything about history, it will fail on that criteria. But the thing about hypotheses, with pretty much all of the life in social sciences, is that you are studying things that are so complex that you will never be able to find a hypothesis which perfectly captures all observed behavior. Hell, even physics hasn't managed that. Interestingly, I recently made the decision to add Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations to my TBR list because a YouTuber I sometimes watched announced that he was making a video dunking on Samuel Huntington and asking his audience if he should admit to mitigating factors in one of Huntington's predictions proving wrong. The fact that he felt the need to ask his audience if he should be intellectually honest about an ideological opponent convinced me that I needed to add Huntington's book to my own reading list. If this YouTuber was openly prepared to misrepresent Huntington's views, how many other accounts of the book have misrepresented it, whether maliciously or accidentally? I read the introduction in order to decide how soon I want to read this book. I decided that because it is mainly a book of political science, and Huntington explicitly says that his intended audience is people making decisions in international relations, it's nowhere near a priority for me. On the other hand, in the introduction, Huntington makes the exact point that I was already going to make about Diamond, but much more cogently than I would have. Essentially, he says that no hypothesis in political science will ever explain things completely. In picking a hypothesis to work off of, therefore, a good general principle is to focus on the hypothesis that explains the most things with the fewest variables from among the available hypotheses. Academic historians, of course, would say that the point of history is not to explain patterns in history, but simply specific times and places. And perhaps that is satisfying to academic historians and historical fiction writers, but I don't think that's satisfying to pretty much anyone else. I certainly am interested in hypotheses about broader patterns in history, and I think that Jared Diamond's account answers the question he was asking: why did Europeans conquer nearly all of the non-Eurasian world, far better than any of the competing hypotheses I'm aware of? And it does it with what are ultimately really two major variables. How long is a continent in the east-west direction, and how many major domesticable potential draft animals were left for modern humans to domesticate? If Diamond's critics want to disprove him, they are going to need to do better than nitpicking over details or ad hominem attacks that misrepresent his position. They will need to develop alternative theories of their own with greater explanatory power. Until that happens, however, I will continue to take Jared Diamond's hypothesis as the best explanation for the questions Diamond sought to answer. So what does this all tell us? One of the most obvious facets of historians' criticism of Diamond is that quite a lot of academic historians are parochial, prescriptive, and narrow-minded. They have for their own reasons a strong objection to seeking patterns in history, and seek to guilt or shame academics in other fields and people outside of academia away from doing the same. But what else is new? This is simply tribalism, and not a particularly interesting form. I find it interesting how brazenly many of Diamond's critics misrepresent his actual claims. Hanlon's razor says we should never seek malice where incompetence will suffice, and so at this point I think it's worth noting that back when I learned how much historians hated this book, I remember being surprised at how few people who started the book actually finished it. I would estimate that at least 80% of people I've met who say they tried to read the book also say that they could not get through it. Nearly everybody I have met who failed to finish the book cited Diamond's writing as the reason they could not get through it. Now, I found the book extremely readable. In fact, I've read it twice. The last time I read it was around a decade ago, though, and I think that it merits rereading sometime soon. But I've also learned that there are a lot of writers whom I find quite easy, but most people find rather hard. And so me finding a book is easy does not necessarily mean that it's an easy read for most people. But even for me, Jared Diamond got noticeably worse as a writer with time, as I assume his publishers demanded less and less editing from his books. I've met a few other people who finished Guns, Germs, and Steel. The book that followed, Collapse, is noticeably less readable, and my late father is the only person I know besides myself who finished that book. And then I read The World Until Yesterday, and while I made it through this book, it was an absolute chore, and I'm not sure I will ever reread it, despite the many interesting ideas Diamond introduced me to here. However, I think perhaps my biggest takeaway is that this is a good demonstration of a rule laid out by C.S. Lewis. People who do not appreciate a thing at its best are in no way qualified to criticize it at its worst. Academic historians are making a category error when they contemn the book for its failings as a work of academic history, something it was never intended to be. But academic historians who oppose and reject all attempts to identify and explain larger patterns in history, on the grounds that they will either always be wrong, or that any such theory which is imperfect is worthless, are the absolute worst people to evaluate whether such works have any merit to them. Finally, historians' mistreatment of Jared Diamond over Guns, Germs, and Steel has reinforced for me 2 points that Nassim Nicholas Taleb made in Anti-Fragile. First, when you see a whole lot of critics criticizing a work for varied and inconsistent reasons, or condemning a work dishonestly, that means they find it threatening and you should seek to understand why it threatens them. I've already mentioned that a YouTuber openly asking whether to misinterpret Samuel Huntington led me to buy his book, read his introduction, and put it on my TBR at least somewhere. But it is striking to me that historians simultaneously judge Guns, Germs, and Steel as if it were a work of academic history, while also dismissing it as a pop history. I've seen a similar double-bind pattern in criticism of writers such as Gary Tobes and Johann Hari, which is something I plan on addressing in future videos. Secondly, any publicity really is good publicity, or at least bad publicity, badly conducted, does not seem to harm good ideas. Outside of the circles of academic historians and people who associate with academic historians, I found a lot more people who have heard of Guns, Germs, and Steel and consider Diamond's thesis credible than I've met people who know just how much academic historians hate this book. Diamond's legacy and reputation are safe. What is more dangerous is when good ideas either get co-opted to serve essentially the opposite of their essential purpose, or even worse, ignored entirely. And indeed, I've discovered quite a few examples of both, which I would also like to discuss in future videos. So if you're interested in hearing more about this kind of thing, please consider liking and subscribing, and YouTube is recommending another one of my videos you might like up here.